We don't know the soldier on the bottom. We don't know his name. But the soldier with the canteen is Richard Rowland Kirkland of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry. This statue commemorates his status as the Angel of Marie's Heights. Probably you've all heard about that. And the story is that on December 14th, 1862, the day after the major fighting here, the Union troops were still out in the field after a frigid night in the cold amidst the dead. They're still out in the field, and their wounded are still lying, many of them, close to the wall. The closest the Union troops got to the wall is probably about 40 yards or so, which is just about where these houses are on the other side. And Richard Kirkland from South Carolina, who by all accounts was a genial, pleasant, determined young man, decided that he could no longer stand the cries of the Union wounded out beyond the stone wall. And so he went to his commanding officer and said, I want to go out and help. And his commanding officer said, no, it's too dangerous. He went to the regimental commander and said, I want to go out and help. No, it's too dangerous. And then he goes to Joseph Kershaw, who is the commander of his brigade, whose headquarters, or his presence at least, he is at that moment in the upper floor of the Stevens house over here. And Kirkland goes up the stairs, gets his attention. Apparently Kershaw knew him. They lived near each other. But we don't know that they, clearly a general is not friends with a sergeant in all likelihood. But he says, General, I can't do this. I have to go out and help these men. And Kershaw says, you will die if you do this. And he said, I need to try. And so they went back and forth, and finally Kershaw gave him the permission to go out into the field and to care for these men. And then I'll just read you one account of it, written in 1896. He secured a dozen or more canteens, filled them with water, and crossed over the rock wall. The enemy thought at first that he was after plunder. The Confederates had done a lot of plundering of the dead the night before, and they rained shot and shell upon him. Undaunted, he went on his mission of mercy. The enemy saw him raise the head of a wounded soldier, place it on his knee, and give him water. Immediately firing ceased, and cheers went up from every throat, friend and foe, and the noble Kirkland carried out his noble mission and returned safely to our line of battle. A few months later, 9 months later, Kirkland was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga in North Georgia. And his body was eventually recovered by his family, buried in the family graveyard near Camden, South Carolina, with a board on it that said RRK. That's all. Most family cemeteries didn't have extensive headboards or markings historically because the families knew where everybody was. And so for years, he lay there in that condition. Now, the story of Kirkland did not emerge publicly until 1880, when a reporter heard about it and heard about the encounter between Kirkland and Kershaw, his commanding officer, and wrote to Kershaw, and he heard about an encounter between a soldier and Kershaw, and wrote to Kershaw and said, who was this soldier? And Kershaw wrote back and said, it was Richard Kirkland, and this is what happened, essentially what I just described to you. It made lightning rounds across America at the time. Reconstruction was over, and people were starting to pine for some good news with respect to the Civil War. And this story certainly seemed to offer that, this humanity between enemies. By 1900, the Kirkland story loomed large in American culture. The United Daughters of the Confederacy embraced it as evidence of the nobility of Southern soldiers. Northerners accepted it, especially Northerners willing and wanting to see some sort of reconciliation between the sections, looking for things about their former enemies that they could embrace. And what were some of those things? Courage, determination, humanity, when it existed. In 1900 or so, 1909 rather, the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy, Kirkland had become famous enough that the UDC, with the permission of the family, removed his body from the Forgotten Family Cemetery and put it in the main cemetery in Camden, South Carolina, just a few yards from Joseph Kershaw's grave, as a matter of fact. One UDC member wrote at the time, "Little did Richard Kirkland dream, as he passed among the dying on the battlefield that day long ago, with his battered canteens touching thirsty lips, that he was making for himself a deathless name. Little did he know that an angel hovered over him with a wreath of fame held just over his brave young brow." About the same time, a man named Walter Clark from North Carolina wrote a famous poem. He prefaced the poem by writing, "He who faces death in brave defense of friends or flag or fireside merits and receives the applause of men. But he who bares his breast to carry aid and comfort to his bitter foes treads a pathway that lies above the common plane of human courage and rises to the higher, purer ether of the morally sublime." And then he wrote a poem called "The Angel of Marie's Heights." And it concludes, "I'm sure in the book of gold where the blessed angel writs the names that are blessed of God and men, he wrote that day with a shining pen, then smiled and loving wrote again, the Angel of Marie's Heights." And that's the origin of this term, the Angel of Marie's Heights. Now, the UDC marked this grave. There were memorial water fountains put up in Camden, South Carolina to him. But the idea of a monument did not first come here in the 1960s, but in the 1930s, where the local American Legion Post proposed a monument to Kirkland here. They tried to raise $25,000, couldn't do it, and so the idea went away. But the idea for the monument, as one man put it, one reporter said, "Yet another step was planned to heal the old wounds laid open." Many people saw this effort to commemorate Kirkland as an effort to heal old wounds, to reconcile the nation. And certainly that would have been in 1930 consistent with the tenor that attended the creation of this park. The speech, the keynote speech created or made at the dedication of this park in 1928 had this as its major climactic passage: "We do more to dedicate these fields in memory of things which have passed. We consecrate them in the spirit of Lee and Lincoln to a more perfect understanding between the South and the North, and to an abundant increase in brotherly love." In 1960, a local doctor, Richard Lanier, who was born in Augusta, Georgia, not far, as many of you know, if you know your geography, not too far from South Carolina, and Camden, South Carolina in specific. He came up with the idea yet again, in connection with the centennial, of a monument to Kirkland. The idea first was to raise money. He went to South Carolina, got $15,000 from South Carolina. Went to the legislature of Virginia, got $5,000, and then was able to raise about $5,000 locally. And the idea was to take the monument and put it behind the visitor center. But then the confluence of a happy event came to him, and that is Russell Sullivan decided to develop this land, and the college bought it. And Mr. Lanier or Dr. Lanier approached the college and said, "May we use that property for the monument?" And the college said yes. The college would actually own this land until 1989, when they swapped it for 18 acres off of our 18 acres of Park Service land out off of Mine Road. We don't do that much anymore, so don't get any ideas, but that's how it came into the park. Lanier organized and recruited a sculptor who was pretty well known at the time, and might be known to some of you, Felix de Weldon, the man who created the Iwo Jima monument in Arlington. De Weldon was taken by the Kirkland story and agreed to do the monument for $25,000, which was, relatively speaking, a pittance for him to do a work of that magnitude. The dedication for the monument took place on September 29th, 1965. It was literally, I believe, the last act of the Civil War centennial in America. I have a sense that they probably wanted it to be much earlier than that, but September 18th, 1965 was the best they could do. It was not a huge deal locally. About 200 people showed up. We have about 150 here tonight. The governor of Virginia was here. The ambassador of Ireland was here at the time. the governor, and the ceremony here that day is a great example of how we use history in service of the present. All of us do. Our successors will, their successors will. We always use history to help us understand the present. Governor Albertus Harrison, who spoke at the dedication, he said rather mildly, "We often meet after the battle in the hope for peace and in sorrow that so many lives were necessary to ensure the continued course of freedom. But we do not meet today on a note of regret. We meet in exultation that in one of the costliest battles of America's wars, fighting men paused and responded with cheers to the exhibition of a human trait common to all," which of course was humanity. But here's more evidence. Here's evidence of how we see the past through our present lens. The ambassador, remember this is 1965. Vietnam is ongoing. Cold War is boiling hot. The ambassador from Ireland had this to say. He called Kirkland's Act an unspoken protest against the horrors of war. And in this respect, the century which has elapsed has seen the vindication of his protest. An even more clear rejection by nearly all countries of war as an instrument of national policy, an ever more universal and urgent search for a way of peace. And then there was an editorial in a South Carolina newspaper about the monument dedication. It started by describing the execution of 2 shot down American pilots in Vietnam by the Viet Cong. They were shot down, taken up, and then executed. And the newspaper took this opportunity to contrast that moment with the dedication of this statue here. And it said, speaking of the dedication here on September 29th, "It happened in Virginia and Vietnam this week, the opposite ends of the earth, revealing the depth of the void between Christ and communism." So we use history all the time. So can it be any surprise to you today, in this tumultuous age of ours with respect to the history of the Civil War, that people are beginning to see this event, not so much the statue, but the event through a slightly different lens? And of course, they are. So think of it, if you will, when you have a fierce argument with someone you love. The process of untangling those passions on a personal level. It's hard. It's one of the hardest things you can do. You have to get done being mad. You have to be able to talk to the person. And then you have to be able to forgive and hopefully forget. The nation went through the exact same process. And unfortunately, like for me and my wife, it usually takes a couple hours. For the nation, it's a process not over yet, as a matter of fact. But what happens when forgetting, which I hope we all forgive and forget, right? That's the great phrase. What happens when forgetting hurts? When forgiving alienates people. So I want you to think, and this is the heavy thinking part of the program, if you will. In the aftermath of trauma, 9/11, Vietnam War, the Civil War, we accord the rights to the memory of that event, first and foremost, to those who were personally affected by it. The soldiers in New York City, the victims and their families. Virtually everything that we as a nation do to commemorate an event like that now is kind of, not formally, but informally at least, run by them. We always check, is that going to be okay? Is that going to offend anyone? After the Civil War, the veterans held that place. The memory of this event was accorded to the veterans. And they kind of set the terms of this untangling of passions. And they decided and worked toward an untangling of passions that focused on the things that they could agree upon. And what were those things that old soldiers, former enemies, could agree upon? Not political things. They agreed upon each other's courage, valor, right? Determination, Humanity, perfect. All those things play into it. And it's not surprising then that the nation began to look for places that would embody those spirits. Have you ever wondered why America preserves more acres of Civil War land, Civil War battlefield land, than the rest of the world combined preserves related to all wars ever fought since the beginning of mankind? Think about that. Battlefields as a place of remembrance, a way to preserve the common virtues of both sides, became supremely important to the nation. John Gordon, Confederate general, first president, or one of the first presidents of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, he said, "The unseemly things which occurred in the great conflict between the states should be forgotten, or at least forgiven, and no longer permitted to disturb complete harmony between North and South." What were those things that should be forgotten? The cause of the war? The uncomfortable issue of slavery? The legacy of civil rights and Reconstruction? All of those things were difficult. And so what happened? America, white America, began to move away. But let me tell you a story that took place a few hundred yards from here in 1884. 1880, the Kirtland story comes out. Big news. 1884, Union veterans are coming to Fredericksburg to commemorate Memorial Day. Now, Memorial Day commemorations in Fredericksburg between 1870 and 1884 had been orchestrated and managed entirely by the African American community. They felt a right place, a righteous place, to be on that hill in the National Cemetery to pay honor to those soldiers who they knew had something to do with freedom for 12,000 African Americans in this region. So for years they ran those ceremonies. And then in 1884, a group of Union veterans asked to come down and participate. And as a gesture of reconciliation, they invited the Confederate veterans locally to join them in this commemoration up on Willis Hill in the cemetery. And local Confederate veterans said, "Sure, we'd like to, so long as the colored people are not involved." And so from that point on, eventually, within a matter of years, the tradition of African Americans honoring the legacy of emancipation as it manifested itself on that hillside ended. And ever since then, the African American community has had a vast chasm between this story and them. Just a few years ago, I was giving a tour downtown of slavery and slave sites in town. For 3 black churches, full buses, 2 buses, sites people had seen all over the place, but they didn't know they were connected to this story. We were going along, I was the only white person on the tour, I was in my uniform, and about halfway through an older gentleman came over and he was talking to me, thanked me for doing it, and he said to me, "Are you going to get in trouble for doing this?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I didn't think you were allowed to do this." That is a chasm. And that chasm, to some extent, is rooted in an eagerness for reconciliation, an eagerness to forget, an eagerness to forgive. Now, reconciliation is not a bad thing. It's a remarkable thing. But reconciliation is a complicated thing. And what we're being asked today, as we kind of reassess the place of the Civil War in our memory, is to recognize that some aspects of forgetting hurt just as much as some aspects of remembering. And so in the last few years, some have stepped forward to question whether or not Richard Kirkland ever did this. I've not heard one suggesting the monument come down, or any of our monuments come down in national parks, and that's not going to happen. But some have questioned the story. It's just too convenient. 1880, no one wrote about it before. No one mentioned Kirkland at the time. All of these things. And so there's kind of a current of thought that, well, maybe this is part of this effort to find common ground not necessarily on a foundation of truth, but a foundation of wishful thinking. Now, I have looked at everything. We have a whole bunch of historians who looked at everything, and I have to tell you, there's pretty strong evidence that somebody went over the wall. Walt Whitman, who was at Chatham, caring for the wounded, talked to one soldier who said, he asked him how the Confederates treated him as he laid out in this field. And he mentioned one man who came along and helped him. While others looted, this one man came along and helped. And then in 1870, long before Kershaw, another Confederate officer wrote his memoir and mentioned the soldier going over the wall to help the wounded. So there's little question in my mind that someone went over the wall. And the idea that in 1880, Joseph Kershaw would attach a name to that place with details makes perfect sense. But when you hear questions about the story, don't get mad. Understand where it's coming from. It's coming from a pushback against a long tradition in American history here of this purely seeing the reconciliation that took place after the war in positive terms. It is a positive thing, but there is collateral damage. And if you don't doubt that, just look at our cultural landscape today and how people are meandering their way through it. It's a complicated story and a complicated place here.